November 1971, Kowloon, Hong Kong. The broadcast lasted 12 minutes. At minute 9, the audio cut without explanation. There were 8 people inside the studio when it happened. Only 3 of them ever spoke about it in detail, and none agreed on what they solely on what they felt when it was over. Bruce Lee never mentioned the incident publicly. Not once, but according to a junior sound technician identified only as Chan, the interruption wasn't a technical failure. It was ordered, he said years later. The producer stood up and cut the signal himself, because something had already gone too far. Moments before the silence, a 320-pound strong man brought in as a novelty guest had placed both hands on Bruce Lee's shoulder and shoved him, not as a joke, but as a challenge. The kind that doesn't belong on air. What followed lasted less than 10 seconds. One of the hosts would later describe it this way: "I thought the big man was going to break him. Instead, I couldn't tell who was in danger." When the broadcast resumed, nothing was explained. The tone had changed. The laughter was gone, and the strong man who had arrived loud, smiling, and Sutton was no longer speaking. His right arm, witnesses say, remained unnaturally still for the rest of the show. No footage survives, only fragments, testimonies, contradictions, and a single decision Bruce Lee made in that room that no one there forgot. Late 1971, Hong Kong was not yet convinced. Bruce Lee had returned from America with a reputation that didn't sit comfortably with the local martial arts community. To some, he was a promising film actor. To others, he was a man who talked too openly, too critically, about traditions that older masters considered untouchable at the time. The Big Boss had only just begun to circulate in theaters. Its success was building, but not yet cemented. Lee was in a transitional phase, visible, but not fully accepted. Known, but not fully understood. He wasn't established yet, said radio assistant producer Wang Kowloon, who worked on the Kowloon station where the broadcast took place. People came to see if he was real, or just another performer. That uncertainty mattered, because Hong Kong's martial arts culture in the early 1970s was not shaped by public demonstrations or open challenges. Reputation was built quietly. Within closed circle schools, rooftops, back rooms, claims were tested privately. Failures were rarely spoken about. Bruce Lee disrupted that. He spoke about efficiency over tradition, directness over form. He questioned long-standing methods publicly, in interviews that circulated faster than many masters could respond. To younger practitioners, it was compelling, to older ones, it was offensive. There was tension around him, said Chan, the sound technician. Even when he wasn't fighting anyone. The radio appearance itself was meant to soften that image. According to archived scheduling notes, the program was a late evening variety, segment part interview, part entertainment. The producers wanted something accessible, something that would present Lee not as a disruptor, but as a personality the public could accept. They paired him with a known strongman performer, locally recognized for demonstrations of brute strength, bending metal rods, lifting weighted platforms, allowing multiple men to hang from his arms. Without losing balance, it was meant to create contrast, speed versus mass, technique versus raw power, entertainment. But there was a miscalculation because, to the audience, and more importantly, to the man sitting across from Bruce Lee. The comparison carried implication. If you put a strongman next to a fighter, Wang later said, someone will want to know which one actually wins. And that question, even unspoken, changes the room. Witnesses described the atmosphere before the broadcast as controlled, but tense. Not hostile yet, but not relaxed either. The strongman, identified in partial records as Lau, arrived early, already in performance mode. He laughed loudly, moved deliberately, and tested the studio furniture with casual displays of force pressing down on tables, flexing his grip around chairbacks. Bruce Lee arrived later. He was smaller than many expected in person, lean, compact. There was no visible effort in how he carried himself, but also no attempt to impress. He looked calm, Chan said, but not in a friendly way. More like he was measuring everything. They shook hands once. According to one witness, Lau squeezed harder than necessary. Bruce did not respond. That moment passed without comment, but it did not go unnoticed because in environments like that, tight spaces, unfamiliar men, unspoken expectations, small gestures establish the terms of what follows. And by the time the red light switched on, signaling the start of the live broadcast, those terms had already begun to shift. This was no longer just an interview. It was a test neither man had openly agreed to, but both understood. The man they brought in was not a novelty in the way the producers intended. His name appears inconsistently. In records, sometimes as Lao Fuqua, sometimes shortened to just Lao. No formal competition history survives, but multiple witnesses confirmed he was well known within Hong Kong's exhibition circuit at the time. He was not a bodybuilder. He was a working strongman. He didn't train for appearance, said Wang. He trained for demonstration. Real weight, real strain. Accounts place him at over 300 pounds, with most estimates settling around 320. Not refined mass, but dense, functional weight thick through the chest, shoulders, and forearms. His hands, according to Chan, were wide enough to hide a teacup. He earned money performing in public spaces, temple fairs, small theaters, private events where the audience stood close enough to see the effort. He bent iron rods slowly, not theatrically. He supported wooden beams across his shoulders while men climbed onto them. There were no stage tricks reported in those demonstrations. He liked people to feel it was real, Chan said, because it was. More importantly, Lau was not unfamiliar with violence. 2 separate testimonies from a former dock worker and a part-time security man suggest he had been involved in physical altercations outside performance settings. Nothing formally documented, but consistent in description. When challenged, he did not hesitate. And he did not rely on technique. He relied on force. That distinction mattered, because unlike trained martial artists, who often operate within controlled exchanges timing, distance rhythm Lau's approach was direct. Close distance quickly, overwhelm, use weight as pressure, not just impact. It's not about hitting, the dock worker said in a later interview. It's about making the other man unable to move. Against an average opponent, that method worked. Against someone smaller, it could end things immediately, which is why his presence beside Bruce Lee created a specific kind of tension. Not theatrical, but practical. The size difference was undeniable. Witnesses placed Bruce at around 135 to 145 pounds at the time, less than half of Lau's mass. No one in that studio had seen them interact physically before the broadcast. There was no agreed demonstration, no structured comparison, but Lau, according to multiple accounts, did not view the situation as neutral. He thought it was a setup for him to show something. Wang admitted years later, maybe not a fight, but a moment. During the pre-show waiting period, Lau reportedly asked one of the hosts, off microphone, "So he's fast, but can he take pressure?" The question wasn't answered, but it didn't need to be, because Lau began answering it. Himself, he moved closer than necessary during setup. Sat slightly angled, his body not fully facing the hosts, but oriented toward Bruce. His movements were slow, deliberate, and aggressive, but not passive either. At one point, as recalled by Chan, Lau placed his hand flat on the table between them and pressed down. The wood creaked audibly. It wasn't a performance. There was no announcement, no explanation, just a sound. Bruce Lee watched it happen. No reaction, no adjustment in posture. But his eyes shifted briefly from Lau's hand to his shoulder, then back. A small detail, but one that suggests calculation. Because pressure, applied correctly, doesn't require speed. And for perhaps the first time that evening, the imbalance between them wasn't theoretical anymore. It was measurable. By the time the broadcast began, Lau had already established something without saying it directly. If this turned physical, even for a moment he would not hold back first. And everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, had begun to understand the same thing. It was not a staged contrast. It was an uncontrolled variable. The studio was smaller than most people imagine. Not a performance hall, not a stage. A single rectangular room on the second floor of a commercial building in Kowloon, soundproofed walls. Low ceiling, air thick with the heat of equipment that had been running since late afternoon. The main table sat at the center, rectangular, with just enough space for 4 seated guests and 2 microphones suspended from adjustable arms. Distance between Bruce Lee and Lau was less than 1 meter, close enough that neither man could fully extend his arm without entering the other's space. There was no separation, Chan said, no buffer. Once you leaned forward, you were already too near. The format of the show did not account for physical demonstration. There were no mats, no open floor, no handlers or assistants trained to intervene, just hosts, a technician behind glass, and a producer positioned near the door. And yet, from the first minutes of the broadcast, the structure began to loosen. The hosts started as planned like questions, controlled tone. They asked Bruce about his recent return from America, about his philosophy of movement, about the growing attention around his film work. Bruce answered calmly, but not passively. His voice remained even, but his responses were direct, sometimes cutting through the phrasing of the questions rather than following them. "Efficiency is not a style," he said at one point. "It's the removal of what is not necessary." Across from him, Lau listened without interruption, but witnesses noticed the shift in his posture. He stopped, leaning back. Wong recalled. He came forward slowly, like he wanted to feel the distance. Closing. About 6 minutes into the broadcast, the hosts introduced Lau more formally. They described his strength, demonstrations, his public performances. his reputation for physical endurance. Then came the suggestion, not a challenge at least, not in wording. One of the hosts, identified in station records as Chung Wai, laughed lightly and said, "Perhaps we can see a small comparison. Speed and strength, side by side." There was hesitation, not from Lau but from Bruce, according to Chan. Bruce's eyes moved briefly not to Lau, but to the microphones, then toward the glass window where the technician sat. A quick assessment. Space, obstacles, constraints he gave. A small nod, but he did not stand. That mattered, because remaining seated kept the environment controlled, or at least it should have. Lau responded differently. He adjusted his chair closer, not dramatically, just a few inches, but enough that his knees nearly aligned with the edge of the table, reducing the already narrow gap between them. There were no formal rules established, no signal to begin, no agreement on what comparison, meant only proximity and expectation. Witnesses described the air in the room, changing not louder, not chaotic, but tighter. The hosts' voices lost some of their rhythm. Questions became shorter. Pauses stretched slightly longer than intended. It felt like something unscripted was coming, Wang said, but no one stopped it. Then Lau made the first move. Not a strike, not even fast. He lifted his right arm and placed his hand on Bruce Lee's left shoulder, flat, deliberate. The contact itself was not violent, but the pressure was, Chan described, seeing the fabric of Bruce's shirt compress under the weight of Lau's palm, the muscle beneath shifting slightly under force. It was a test, direct, unambiguous, and in that moment, several things became clear at once. There would be no demonstration, no controlled comparison, no shared understanding of limits, only reaction, because Lau didn't remove his hand. He pressed, and then he pushed. Not enough to throw Bruce from his chair, but enough to move him. A visible displacement, a shift in balance, the kind that forces an immediate decision. Around the table, no one spoke. One of the hosts later admitted he reached instinctively toward the microphone, as if to interrupt, but stopped halfway. Because what was happening now was no longer part of the broadcast. It was something else, and it had already started. The push moved. Bruce Lee less than 6 inches, but it was enough. His chair legs scraped once against the floor short. Controlled, not a loss of balance, but a forced adjustment. His torso shifted back, then settled forward again, spine realigning almost immediately. What changed was not his position, it was his focus. Witnesses described his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in concentration, the kind that removes everything else from the room. The microphones, the hosts, the sound of the broadcast, all of it dropped away. Only the contact remained. Lau's hand was still on his shoulder, still pressing. He didn't snatch it away. Chan said, "That's what I remember. Most people would react fast or panic. He didn't do either. Instead, Bruce moved slowly. His left hand came up not to strike, but to meet Lau's wrist, not gripping at first, just touching. Measuring, there was a pause. Less than a second, then the structure of the exchange changed. Bruce's fingers closed around the outside of Lau's wrist while his thumb pressed inward, just above the joint. At the same time, his shoulder rotated not backward, but slightly inward. Reducing the surface, Slough could apply pressure to a small movement, but it altered the leverage. Lau reacted by increasing force. Witnesses saw his forearm tighten, veins surfacing as he drove more weight through his hand, attempting to maintain dominance over the contact point. That's when Bruce shifted again. Not with speed, with precision. He leaned forward into the pressure, not away from it closing. The distance between them by several inches. His right hand rose and made brief contact with Lau's elbow, not striking, but redirecting the angle. 2 points of control now. Wrist.elbow. Double quotes after that, Wang said. It didn't look like a push anymore. It looked like something being taken apart. Lau's arm, which had been applying downward force, began to turn outward subtly at first, then more visibly. The line of pressure broke. His shoulder followed the rotation, pulled slightly forward. By the change in angle, the movement was not dramatic, but it was irreversible. Bruce maintained contact throughout, no wasted motion, no separation. His grip adjusted once, tightening at the wrist as his thumb pressed deeper into a nerve point along the forearm. Lau's expression changed. Not pain, not yet confusion, because the expected resistance never came. Instead of pushing back, Bruce had redirected everything, and in doing so, he had moved inside the strongman's strength. There was a moment, Chan recalled, where the big man tried to correct it. You could see him trying to pull his arm back. He couldn't, not fully, because the more he pulled, the more the angle tightened. Bruce's right hand shifted again, this time not to the elbow, but just above it, guiding the arm into a slight bend. Not enough to be obvious to the audience, but enough to compromise structure. Then came the only fast movement in the entire exchange. A short, sharp rotation of Bruce's torso driven from the hips, not the arms. It lasted less than half a second, but it changed everything. Lau's upper body tilted forward just slightly, just enough that his center of gravity moved ahead of his base. His planted feet didn't shift, but his balance did. A controlled imbalance, engineered, not forced. And for the first time since the contact began, Lau was no longer dictating the interaction. He was reacting around the table. The silence deepened. No one spoke, no one moved, because what they were witnessing did not look like a fight. It looked like control, being established piece by piece, in real time. And it wasn't finished, because Bruce Lee had not released him. He had only begun to apply pressure in return. The shift from control to damage happened quietly. There was no visible strike, no sudden escalation that an untrained eye would immediately recognize. But those closest to the table understood the change the moment. Lau's breathing altered, it shortened, sharpened. Bruce still held the wrist, still guided the elbow, but now the angle had tightened. Beyond correction, Lau attempted to resist, not by pulling back this time, but by driving forward with his body weight, trying to collapse the space between them. It was a natural reaction for someone used to overwhelming opponents at close range. If he could close fully, he could smother the leverage, but the room worked against him. The table blocked his hips. The chair limited his base. His size, which gave him power, now restricted his movement. Bruce adjusted immediately. He didn't retreat. He shifted half a step to the side, just enough to let Lau's forward pressure pass slightly offline. At the same time, his right hand dropped from the elbow to the inside of the forearm, reinforcing the rotation. The joint alignment broke, not visibly, but structurally. There was a sound, Chan said. Not loud, but not normal either. A dry, internal click. Lau froze, not out of discipline, out of recognition, because at that angle, wrist turned, elbow compressed, shoulders slightly forwards, there was no strength left to apply. Only consequence, Bruce felt it too. Witnesses described a brief stillness less than a second, where both men stopped moving. In that space, the outcome was already decided. All that remained was how far it would go. Lau's face changed first. The confidence that had carried him into the room didn't disappear, it fractured. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing not in aggression, but in calculation. He understood the position, and he understood what would happen if the pressure increased. Even slightly, he knew, Wang said. Anyone who has been in a hold like that knows, but Lo did not yield. Not immediately. Instead, he tested a fraction of movement, a small attempt to pull his arm free. That was when Bruce responded, not with speed, with pressure, incremental, measured, the kind that doesn't shock the body, but convinces it. Lau's shoulder dipped forward involuntarily. His torso followed, bending at an angle that no longer supported his weight. His left hand moved instinctively toward the table. Searching for balance, his right arm remained trapped, and then the pain registered. Witnesses saw it in different ways, some in the tightening of his eyes, others in the sudden stillness of his mouth, but all agreed on one detail. He stopped breathing for a moment, not by choice, because the body had shifted from resistance to preservation. Bruce held the position, not escalating further, but not releasing. This was the point of decision. He could have broken it, Chan said quietly. I'm sure of that. The leverage was complete. The angle precise. A slight increase in rotational force applied through the wrist, while stabilizing the elbow would have transferred directly into the joint. Elbow. First dot. Permanent damage. And in that confined space, with no room to fall or roll. The injury would have been immediate. Bruce knew it, Lau knew it. No one else in the room fully understood, but they felt it, because the energy had changed again. Not tense, not uncertain, resolved. Bruce's expression, according to Wang, was no longer analytical. It was conflicted. He wasn't angry, Wang said. That's what stayed with me. If he was angry, it would have been simpler. Instead, there was hesitation, not in his grip, but in his intent. For a brief moment, his eyes lifted not to Lau, but past him toward nothing in particular, as if checking something, internal rather than external. Then he made the choice. The pressure stopped increasing, and just as carefully as he had built the position, he began to release it, not all at once, gradually, allowing the joint to return to alignment without shock. His hands guided the movement, ensuring there was no sudden recoil, no uncontrolled reaction. Lau didn't move at first, even as the hold loosened, even as his arm regained freedom. He remained in place, bent slightly forward, breathing unevenly. When Bruce finally let go completely, the strongman's right arm did not drop. It stayed where it was, close to his body, guarded, uncertain. No one spoke. The hosts were frozen, unsure whether to continue or stop. The microphones hung between them, still live, still transmitting silence. Behind the glass, the producer stood and made a decision of his own. He reached forward and cut the sound when the broadcast returned. It did so without acknowledgement. Music filled the gap, first brief, misplaced, followed by a voice that sounded tighter than before. The host resumed with a question that had no connection to what had just occurred. Film schedules, future projects. Safe ground, Bruce answered. His tone had not changed, but something else had. According to Chan, who remained behind the glass, Bruce no longer looked at Lau at all. His body angled slightly away, attention directed toward the microphone, toward the structure of the program, as if re-entering it required distance. Lau did not speak for the remainder of the segment. Not once. He sat upright again, but carefully. His right arm remained close to his torso, resting against his side rather than on the table. At one point, he attempted to flex his fingers. The movement was slow, deliberate, as though testing whether control had fully returned. Witnesses noticed the delay. There was nothing broken, Wang said, but something had been close. After the broadcast ended, the room did not immediately clear. No applause, no closing remarks beyond what had already gone out over the air. The red light dimmed, and for a moment no one moved, caught between roles, unsure whether they were still part of a show or something that had stepped outside of it. It was Lau who stood first, not abruptly, with effort. He used his left hand to press against the table as he rose, compensating subtly but noticeably for the stiffness in his right side. When he turned, he did not look at Bruce immediately. He looked at his own arm, rotated it once, tested the joint. Then he faced him. No witnesses reported any apology, no formal words of challenge or concession, only a short exchange, spoken quietly enough that even those closest could not hear it clearly. But Chan, positioned near the door, recalled a fragment. Lau's voice, lower than before. Enough. Whether it was acknowledgement or warning remains unclear. Bruce nodded once. Nothing more. They did not shake hands again. Lau left the studio first, accompanied partway by one of the hosts who seemed unsure whether to assist him or simply follow. His usual presence, the volume, the certainty had diminished. Not erased, but altered. He came in to demonstrate strength, Wang said. He left thinking about something else. Bruce remained behind for several minutes. He sat alone at the table after the others drifted out, his hands resting in front of him, fingers still. Chan observed him through the glass, expecting some visible release, fatigue, tension, anything that marked the end of what had just occurred. There was none, only stillness, but not the same stillness from before. He looked unsettled, Chan said after a long pause. Not because of the man, because of himself. That detail repeated across the few accounts that exist. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something closer to restraint under examination. In the weeks that followed, the incident was not discussed publicly. No recording surfaced. The station archives contained no reference beyond the scheduled appearance. Even among staff, conversation faded quickly, replaced by other programs, other guests. But privately, it lingered. Wang would later describe it as a turning point, not because of what Bruce Lee did, but because of what he chose not to do. At that size difference, he said, no one would have blamed him for ending it. It would have been quick, clear. Instead, it remained unresolved in a different way, controlled, incomplete, and that incompleteness stayed with those who saw it. Years later, when Bruce Lee's reputation had solidified, his speed, his philosophy, his presence were no longer questioned in the same way those who had been in that room did. Not speak about dominance. They spoke about proximity, how close it came, how little separated, demonstration from damage, and how deliberately that line had been held. Chan, who had cut and reconnected sound for countless broadcasts after that night, summarized it with a sentence he never expanded on. He proved what he could do, he said, but more importantly, he showed exactly where he would stop. No footage remains. No official record confirms it. Only a handful of consistent memories, shaped by distance and time, but they all end in the same place. Not with the moment of control, but with the moment it was released. And in that narrow space, between capability and decision, something became clear to everyone who witnessed it. The most dangerous part was not the technique, it was how precisely he chose not to finish it.